program, and her daughter, Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin, with whom I now work closely to plan these special lectures. I'm delighted as well to welcome Dr. Chris Choulos, our new Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Dean Choulos began his tenure at the university last summer, but I haven't seen him in person since we met in March of 2020 during his interview. I know we're all looking forward to returning to a campus that is bustling with students and colleagues in the near future. I also want to thank our talented program coordinator, Diane Siegel, for all of her help in putting this event together, and the incomparable Teresa Jenkins, the manager of technology, facilities, and events in the College of Liberal Arts, whose tireless work this year and every year makes these programs possible. I'll try my best to avoid using pandemic cliches to describe the ways BHI has adapted its programming this year. But the wonderful world of Zoom has enabled us to continue to offer a series of engaging and informative lectures and events that span the globe. This lecture was originally scheduled for last spring, and our speaker was planning to travel to the US from Israel for a book tour and lecture series. We are so pleased that we are finally able to welcome him now via Zoom. Before I formally introduce Dr. Jeremy Benstein, I'd like to share a brief background about the evolution of the Shubin Lectures. As a way to honor the memory of her parents, Soraya and Hannah Shubin, Shoshana Cardin created an endowment fund for a lecture series that originally took place every other year at Baltimore Hebrew University. The Shubins were avid Zionists who made Aliyah to Israel when they were a young couple. They returned to the US after several years, and although they had planned to eventually move back to Israel, unfortunately for a variety of reasons, they never did. Shoshana's father, Soraya, was a staunch supporter of Israel and a leader of the Zionist movement. He was committed to keeping conversational Hebrew alive in the diaspora. He taught Hebrew in this country for many years. Soraya also believed in making an honest assessment of Israel, including what he referred to as, quote, its warts, end quote. He did not feel that this attitude in any way detracted from his abiding love for Israel. The first two Shubin lectures were delivered in Hebrew. However, in order to reach a broader audience, subsequent lectures have all been in English, but remain focused on the Hebrew language, culture, and history. We are so fortunate to welcome today's guest lecturer, Dr. Jeremy Benstein. Dr. Benstein is an educator, author, and self-proclaimed Hebrew lover. He holds a BA in linguistics from Harvard, a master's degree in Judaic studies from the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem, and a doctorate in cultural anthropology from the Hebrew University. He grew up in the Midwest and moved to Israel over 35 years ago. Along the way, he helped found the Heschel Center for Sustainability in Tel Aviv. He is currently the managing editor of 929 English and lives in one of my favorite places in Israel, Zichron Yaakov, with his wife, Professor Annabelle Herzog, 5 children, 2 cats, and many books. He's the author of 2 books. The first, The Way into Judaism and the Environment, was published in 2006, and it is an outgrowth of his work on Jewish studies and environmental issues. His most recent work, Hebrew Roots, Jewish Roots, A Tribal Language in a Global World, published in 2019, is a labor of love for and about the Hebrew language and its role in Jewish history, identity, and peoplehood. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of this book, the link will now be in the chat. If you have questions for Dr. Benstein, please use the Q&A feature to ask them. Following his presentation, we will try to address as many questions as we can. And now I will turn my screen over to our guest, Dr. Jeremy Benstein.
Hello, and thank you for that warm introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I want to thank the Cardin family and the Baltimore Hebrew Institute and Towson University for this opportunity. And as Jill said, my whole Hebrew engagement here, my writing this book over the past several years has really been a labor of love and enthusiasm about the Hebrew language, and a feeling that it is a greatly underappreciated part of our Jewish toolbox, or a component of our Jewish literacy. And so my talk this evening is not particularly academic in a technical sense, and there'll be a little bit some questions I want to raise and talk with you about Hebrew, but I'm hoping no less be able to generate a little bit of enthusiasm about engaging with Hebrew. And so, without further ado, I do have a PowerPoint, so let me share that. Okay. So yes, the title of my book, and kind of part of the message that I have, is that Hebrew roots, Jewish routes, I pronounce it, so you get the distinction there between the roots and the routes. But Hebrew is a tribal language in the sense of our own small little people, and it very much functions in a global world. It always has, but even more so these days. And so here's a few random graphics, and if you can read Hebrew, you can see there are some funny things here. I'll translate most of the humor that I'll bring to you. But this is the cover of the book, and there's a link in the chat, but also you can go to my website where there's more information about the book, and also other places besides Amazon to actually buy it. So that's all I'll say about the book. I wanted to begin with a quote of a colleague of mine. She wrote, Wendy Zerler wrote, "Language is the poetic, emotive, connective tissue of history. Hebrew is not merely a spoken language like any other, it's a portal and a connector to an entire library of Jewish civilization and culture." Okay, it's a beautiful quote, and I love the idea of connectivity, right? I mean, language indeed is one of the main things that connects people to one another, but a particular language can also connect a person to themselves, their own identity, to their past, and a part of that that complex that we call identity that connects us with other people who are from have the same cultural, religious, etc. background. But I want to ask, what is Hebrew? It may sound like a silly question because we all seem to know what Hebrew is, but just think about this for a second. Hebrew is one of the oldest recorded languages, right? Up there with Chinese, I guess, so the Chinese language families. Going back 3,000 years to all kinds of Semitic epigraphs and things like that, and of course the biblical language. But since it was only brought back into spoken use, right, what we call a vernacular language. So I'm not going to be using too many technical linguistic terms, but often people talk about Hebrew having been revived, which would mean that Hebrew was dead, but Hebrew was never dead. It was used obviously for prayer and study, but also for correspondence and things. If a rabbi from an Arab country or a Sephardi culture was going to correspond with an Ashkenazi rabbi, the language they had in common was written Hebrew, and so they indeed wrote to each other. So it was a live literary language, but it wasn't a vernacular. So what happened to Hebrew 140 years ago was that it started becoming revernacularized, kind of a long word, but just meaning brought back into spoken use. So it's one of the oldest and one of the newest languages, which makes it unique on the world stage. And just in parentheses, I'll say, one of the amazing things about Hebrew is that people come from all over the world to study not just Hebrew, the language, but to study this process of how this language that wasn't spoken or wasn't used in daily spoken use came to be indeed have millions of native speakers and become the national language of a country, et cetera, because just like they're endangered species in the environment, that's from my other hat, as you heard in the introduction, there are obviously also endangered languages, and everywhere from Welsh and other Celtic and Gaelic languages to Australian Aboriginal languages. There are plenty of languages that are really struggling to make their vernacular use, their collection of native speakers much broader. And so Hebrew is one of the most inspiring examples of that having happened in the modern age. So we have this dichotomy between old and new. But I also want to ask what is Hebrew Judaism's religious holy tongue, right? What we call Lashon Kodesh, or is it Israel's secular daily language, right? The term Ivrit, even though that's the term we use to refer to Hebrew, is not really a term to refer to the Hebrew language in Jewish sources, right? It was always called Lashon HaKodesh. So is Hebrew one or the other, or can it be both? And this is one of the questions I want to raise and look at it from some different directions. And before I delve into more technical topics, I want to show you a couple of clips using music to sort of flesh out this idea of where the sacred meets the profane, or the holy meets the daily. Okay, and my first clip is of an amazing Israeli vocal artist named Victoria Hana. And this is a clip of a song that she calls the Aleph Bet song, and interspersed with what you'll hear is the Aleph Bet are the words of a liturgical hymn, a piyut, that is sung on Hoshana Rabbah. So I didn't bring the words for that, but you'll see they're a little bit less crucial what the actual words are. I won't say too much about her, except that she is religious. She grew up religious, and she had a terrible problem of stuttering, which she overcame partly through singing and music, and as you can see, some of her vocal exercises.
ألف بيت جمل دلت هي فاف زين حي تيت يود كف لمد ميم نون سمخ عين بي تدي كوف راشين تاف ألف تاف تاف ألف تاف أبقى دفز حتى كلام الناس بتسكر الشداء أبقى دفز حتى كلام الناس بتسكر الشداء شتية لحممة دلو يا عالبلي ما 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 وشانا وشانا دلو يا عالبلي ما وشانا 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 دلو يا عالبلي ما גיבור ורב לא שירה, דרתי בלי עוד שירה, האלה מושיעה, ומציל ומושיעה, זועקך תושיעה, הוכך הושיעה, דלעך תשביעה, לב ולהשפיעה, כל שיח תתשב ותושיעה, לגייבל תרשיעה, מגדים דמתק ותושיעה, נסים להסיעה, שעירים להגיעה, עננים להמניעה, פותח ידך ומשביעה, רחומך תושיעה, שוחריך תושיעה, דמימך תושיעה, אושנה, אושנה, דלו יא בלימה, אושנה, אושנה, אושנה.
Okay, There's more to that, where it came from. You're welcome to look her up on the internet. One of the reasons why I brought that this song is just the amazing, whoops, wait a minute, jumping ahead here. Okay. The amazing meeting point between, on the one hand, the secular art form of a music video clip, as well as some of her performance style being influenced, of course, by jazz and rap and other things. But the content matter of it is, of course, the Hebrew alphabet and the way it's taught there. You saw with the honey on the page, as well as the traditional liturgical hymn, which is also an alphabetical acrostic. So that meeting point, and when I was thinking about that performance and the use of Hebrew language and Hebrew letters in contemporary music, there's obviously a lot to go on, especially from Israeli culture, but I wanted to bring one more thing, and let's see if this works. Okay, hold on, I'm going to show this on YouTube. Sorry, let me just take a second here and find it. Okay, this is Hanan Ben Ari, and it has English subtitles. So I won't say any more about the song.
כמה נוח לזרום עם המוח בהתניות אוטומטיות שלא דורשות לטרוח, רק לתייג ולנבוח, להסיט ולסבוח, לאלילי הרייטינג אייטמים בכל הכוח. הכל כבר מסודר לנו בראש, מגירות, לא ניתן למציאות להפריע לנו לראות שכל שמאלני הוא בוגד, כל ערבי מחבל מתאבד, כל חרדי הוא שודד וכל המתנחלים רצחו את רבין. כל תל אביב טבעונית, כל נתיבות מסורתית עממית, כל הדתיים פרימיטיביים עם ציצית, ועל הדרך מחקו את דרווין. אל תכלאוני בשום כלום, אל תסכמו אותי בוויקיפדיה. אני הכל, אני לא כלום, אור אין סוף לבוש בגוף, אז אל תכלאוני בשום כלום. תקראו לי, אני הכל, אני לא כלום, אור אין סוף לבוש בגוף, אז אל תכלאוני בשום כלום. עוד יבוא יום, ולא תכלאוני בשום כלום, לא תסכמו אותי בוויקיפדיה. אני הכל, אני לא כלום, ברום באתי ושוב, אז אל תכלאוני בשום כלום. לא תכלאוני בשום כלום.
Okay, that was Hanan Ben Ari. That's the end of the musical portion of our program. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. This is one of the frustrations of this format of not being there in person. I would love to get reactions to those videos. I just, again, love the interaction of the ancient and the modern. If you didn't know how to say Wikipedia in Hebrew, now you know it's Wikipedia. But he uses a very biblical phrasing. If you're sensitive, some of you know the Hebrew, when he says Al tichleuni, that's a very biblical way of don't put me in a cage, of trying to define my identity. And again, that's part of the message that I wanted to bring about not limiting our approach to Jewish identity. And I'm going to get back to that in a second, because this isn't just about Hebrew, right? I use Hebrew as a way to think about what it means to be Jewish. So just a few more introductory passages about why it's important to learn Hebrew, or what we might need Hebrew for. Okay, so for instance, if you were to go to the Caribbean, you would probably need Hebrew to read these tombstones of Jewish pirates that were active in previous century and are buried in Caribbean islands, and our graves are marked with Hebrew and skulls and crossbones, amazingly enough. And you would also need Hebrew to make sure you wouldn't get ripped off on eBay, because I don't know if you've ever seen this. This was going around the internet a little while ago. This unique vintage Navajo moose. It's 925 sterling silver pendant. It's only 550. You wouldn't lose a lot. But if you know Hebrew, then of course you realize that it's not a Navajo moose. It's simply a chai shown backwards. And of course you need Hebrew also to understand stupid puns like this. I don't know if you can guess what this is. This would be the audience participation part of our lecture, but I'll divulge it anyway. That is a martini with a green olive. Okay. To move on to more serious questions about Hebrew, one of the reasons why Hebrew is, I think, such a crucial part of potential Jewish literacy. And here, one of the messages, again, I'll repeat it several times. I'm not here to browbeat people into learning Hebrew, far from it. Almost the opposite, in fact, because while full fluency of a language is obviously the gold standard, right? That's when you're exposing yourself or connecting to a language. One of the, the ideal that you might want is to be actually functional and fluent and have mastery of the language. But for many of us, that is an immense investment of time, and sometimes beyond our reach. And the problem is that with languages, I think we often see it as sort of all or nothing, that if you're not going to learn a language for fluency, then there's really no point starting it at all. And if you have, whether you're a parent thinking about the Jewish education of your children, or yourself trying to up your Jewish game, whatever it is. So you think, well, should I study a little Bible or a little Jewish philosophy or a little Jewish history, or should I try to learn Hebrew? And it seems like, well, if I have however many hours I have, it seems like they might be better spent sometimes with other things. And what I want to emphasize is that it's not all or nothing, that just in the same way that you can study a little Bible or a little philosophy or a little history, you can also study a little language, and that's not useless, that in fact, every Hebrew root that you learn, and every Jewish value concept that you learn in the original Hebrew, to understand why translations are so partial and so inadequate often, those are major contributions. So what I'm talking about here is not necessarily committing oneself to everything it would take to learn Hebrew for fluency, but really to connect, the connectivity of it. That's what I referred to. That's what why I began with the quote that I did. So for instance, I'm just using this as an example of the use of Hebrew. This was an initiative promoting Jewish spiritual communities, and I took this off the internet, and the paragraph was, this initiative is designed to support the development of spiritual communities that use the wisdom and practice of Judaism, or chokhmah, to help people live lives of sacred purpose, kedusha, and inspire people to contribute to a more just and peaceful world, tzedek. The context for this work are covenantal communities, kehilot, where a group of people intentionally enter into a mutually obligatory relationship. Okay. Now, of course, you could have this paragraph without the Hebrew words, but when you have these 4 Hebrew words that aren't so much translated in their use in the English, but unpacked or kind of expanded into the full range of connotations of their meanings, then you get a sense of how dense these terms are and how much depth they represent. So, for instance, Chokhmah, you may be familiar with. We just had a Pesach Seder. They're the four sons. The first one is Chacham, right? The wise son. And here they talk about Chokhmah as representing the wisdom and practice of Judaism. And I think that's actually a nice way of parsing the idea of Chokhmah, because it's not just some kind of ivory tower abstract wisdom or knowledge. It's actually, there's a praxis to Chokhmah of how we use our wisdom to improve our lives. So chokhmah, wisdom and practice of Judaism. To live lives of sacred purpose, kedusha, one of my favorite roots. It is used in a million different contexts, in everything from the sanctification over the wine on Friday night, that's beginning of Shabbat, which is kiddush, and the prayer that's said often in services and is also connected to the memory of beloved who are departed. The Kaddish, of course. A marriage is called a kiddushin, a sanctification of relationship. And the committee or the team that deals with taking care of dead bodies before burial is called the Chevra Kadisha. Okay, so the idea of sacredness or sacred purpose in our lives Jewish life is shot through with that, which you can see from the way the language is used. And even more so in terms of what's really encapsulated in a single word, the word tzedek here, which they translate or unpack as a just and peaceful world, because of course, tzedek it means justice. When you think about the other main word that's connected to tzedek, you're probably familiar with tzedakah, right? Which we usually translate as charity. Well, wait a minute, what's the connection between charity and justice? And then you realize, wait a minute, if you translate tzedakah as charity, you are giving it a completely wrong connotation. Charity comes from caritas, which means love. And the idea of charity is sort of a free will offering given by choice, which is a nice thing to give out of love, et cetera, but the Jewish version of charity, as it were, tzedakah is an act of justice. First of all, it's a mitzvah, so it's an obligation, but it's really a statement about how wealth is to be distributed or redistributed. It's not meant to be just an act of free will and loving kindness. It's meant to be an act of obligatory justice, which already says a lot. And there's a whole world encapsulated in that single Hebrew word because of the connection to its root of justice. And of course, the final word here, kehilot, which is used to mean community, as it says here, but they actually take it and connect it to covenantal communities, right? Communities where people enter into a mutually obligatory relationship. Again, a unique Jewish take on the idea of community. So bottom line is that you don't have to speak Hebrew for Hebrew to speak to you. And again, one of the messages that I want to bring here. So the story, if we talked about Hebrew being both the oldest and one of the newest part, right, the recent chapter in the history of Hebrew starts with this man here. This is Eliezer ben Yehuda in a classic pose, right, poring over 20 different books as he was writing one of his magnum opus, as really the Great Historical Dictionary of the Hebrew Language. Just to explain what's on this slide, so there's a great quote by the historian Cecil Roth, who said that before Ben Yehuda, Jews could speak Hebrew, or at least the male Jews, right, the ones who went to Cheder, and there's a whole gendered issue here about who learned Hebrew and what level of capability they had. Put that aside for a second, but after Ben Yehuda, in other words, after the revernacularization of Hebrew, led by Ben Yehuda, some people say, well, he wasn't as central as all that, but he really was the single figurehead most associated with this historical period of essentially 1880 or so to about 1920, and mention in a second. I mean, Hebrew was declared one of the official languages of Palestine by the British Mandate after World War I. And so that was already an indication of its success in coming into actual spoken use. And by that point, it was, of course, girls and boys, women and men in the Yishuv, in the new settlement of Jews in the land of Israel. And in the upper right here, you see sort of a caricature of his very characteristic face, that very pointed goatee and his pince-nez glasses, it's drawn with Hebrew words that are all coinages of his. Okay, actually across the brow is one of his slogans. It says, Daber Ivrit vehivreta, speak Hebrew and you shall become healthy or whole. And all the rest are words that he coined. And I have other lectures where I sort of regale everybody with amazing stories of this man, because he was, besides being a single-minded lunatic, he was just an amazing person in so many ways. Just very briefly about his youth and what he went through before he actually moved to Israel with his young bride. You might see in this picture that he has 3 fingers on his right hand. It's because he had to shoot off or chop off his pinky in order to avoid being drafted into the army, the Russian army. His father passed away when he was very young. His mother couldn't take care of him and his 4 younger siblings, so she actually farmed him out to an uncle. The uncle was apparently even stricter than his own father, who was also known for corporal punishment. But when he discovered little Eliezer at the age of, I think, about 14, reading a book under his covers, right? Not a sacred book, but a novel. And the novel, amazingly enough, was Robinson Crusoe, written in literary Hebrew at the time. He threw him out. He threw him out of his house at the age of 14. He wandered to the next village, fell asleep in a Beit Midrash, and woke up there. A man named Jonas found him. And fortunately for Ben Yehuda, this man was fairly well established and also was in need of a tutor for his daughters. And after a short conversation, he realized that Ben Yehuda was quite a little ilui, a sort of Talmudic genius. I mean, very, very learned, etc. So he brought him home and he started tutoring the daughters. He ended up marrying both of them, not at the same time, of course, but he married the elder daughter. They moved to Palestine. Ben Yehuda, most of his life had tuberculosis, but his first wife died of it. And one of her dying wishes was that her younger sister come to marry Eliezer, take care of their children, and help him finish his life's work. And so, that's the next slide. I'll show you the picture of the couple. But first, I want to say, so he actually. Again, is seen as one of the figureheads of reviving, revernacularizing the Hebrew language, because he was one of the first people to take this as a chief goal. Not, in other words, it was important to go back and live in the land of Israel. It was important to build a Jewish society. But for him, the real goal was to have our own language that we could live in. And not everybody agreed with this. First of all, most of what are called the Jewish intellectuals, the maskilim, people of the Jewish Haskalah, while they wrote in Hebrew and indeed tried to make Hebrew a literary language, like that translation of Robinson Crusoe, they didn't think that Hebrew should be spoken. They felt it should be left in its elevated status as a literary language. Herzl himself, even after Hebrew was already being spoken in the Yishuv from people from the first Aliyah, etc. He didn't think that there was any chance that a language could be revernacularized. And his famous vision of the Jewish state was sort of like a Switzerland on the Mediterranean, of all the Jews coming from their various diasporas, bringing those languages, but of course learning German and the European languages of culture. So Ben Yehuda wasn't necessarily representing the popular will, as it were, although he did fairly quickly attract a cadre of people who were really involved in setting up the first language council and teaching kindergarten teachers how to raise children in Hebrew, and other journalists who were busy putting out, one of the first things he did was put out a newspaper so that people could actually read about and talk about the issues of the day in Hebrew, okay? But not only in terms of the attitudes of Jews to this idea of language, it wasn't just what should they be speaking in Israel, or what would be the solution for the Jewish people, there was another linguistic activist, as it were, and from exactly the same time and exactly the same place, Eliezer ben Yehuda here on the left, and another Eliezer, usually known as Ludwig Zamenhof here on the right. If you don't know his name, that's because he's less well known in the United States. He is, of course, the inventor or deviser of another language called Esperanto. Okay, now why do I call him a linguistic activist? Because he had this dream, almost like John Lennon in his song Imagine, right? That the world is, there's so much divisiveness and violence and internecine conflict and everything else in the world, partially because of our differences. And if we could only find something that we could unify around, something that would help us communicate and connect to one another. And so he felt what we need is a universal language. And this is, there's this text here on the left. I won't read the Esperanto. I'm not sure how it should be pronounced. But on the basis of a neutral language, you can see how close it is to English. I mean, it's kind of like a melange of European, mainly Romance and Germanic languages. On the basis of a neutral language, understanding one another, the people will agree to create one big family circle. And that is, of course, that became the hymn of the vision of Esperanto, which is known as La Espero, which means, of course, Hatikva, or the hope. So amazingly, there was this sort of parallel universe of this particular Jew and other Jews working for cosmopolitanism and the brotherhood of humanity through erasing difference. And they also had this idea of a hope. In fact, the name Esperanto was his pen name. It means the hopeful one, and it became the name of the language. So that's all I'll say about that. But the comparisons are even more interesting. But you're welcome to check that out on your own. So this is Eliezer and his wife, his second wife, sorry, Chemda. And she was the one who actually really contributed a great deal to the fulfillment of his vision, which, like I said, was revernacularizing Hebrew, but doing it in a number of different ways. There was the whole journalistic side, there was the whole educational side, but of course, there was the historical dictionary. And he thought he was going to write this massive modern dictionary of Hebrew, not only documenting all the different stages of the language, but of course, putting in the dictionary all the new coinages of him and Bialik and others who were busy creating all the words that are necessary for all the things that one needs in the modern world that weren't there in a pre-modern language. And so he thought it was going to be this massive volume of 800 pages or something. It turned out to be 8 volumes, each of which is more than 1,000 pages. If you look for it today, it's usually sold in a 16-volume box set. And that was finished several decades after his death, again, by Chemda here. And he is probably the only lexicographer, right, the writer of dictionaries in the world, who one of his first coinages, if he's going to sit down and write a dictionary, he had to actually invent the word for dictionary, okay, which is the word milon, coming from the word milah, okay. Before that, a dictionary was called a sefer milim. So, in fact, one of the things that they did when they coined words was trying to find single words that would replace these sort of cumbersome multi-word phrases. And one could give a whole course about all the neologisms, all the new coinages that took place in order to bring Hebrew up to date and where they came from. We saw that picture of him poring over all those books, because indeed the major source for new Hebrew words would be, of course, the previous Hebrew text, whether it be the Bible or the Mishnah or medieval Hebrew writings, etc. But oftentimes there wasn't appropriate words, the appropriate roots to be used. And so he would often go to Arabic, being a sister Semitic language that was already being spoken in a modern context, and occasionally to other sources as well. So a great story is told about how he received a telegram, right? If you remember what those were, right? This is before email and WhatsApp and everything else. And so when you get a telegram and not just a letter, then it's obviously something fairly urgent. And it's told that he waited for 3 days before he he opened up his Telegram because he realized that he didn't have a Hebrew word for Telegram, and he wanted to choose exactly the right one. And so he coined the word mivrak for Telegram from the word barak, which means lightning. Okay, if the word barak conjures up other images like former American presidents, that's actually a different Semitic word barak, because that is related to bracha or baraka in Arabic, so for blessing. But this one is lightning, so lightning fast, mivrak, Telegram. It's said that his son, and there's all kinds of stories about Itamar ben Yehuda, Itamar ben Avi, his firstborn son, who he and his first wife made a pledge that they would raise him only in Hebrew. And not only raise him only in Hebrew, but that he wouldn't hear any other foreign languages. Okay. And if you think about that for a second, first of all, it means that he probably didn't have too many friends, because by definition, he was the only one who was speaking Hebrew. He was the first native Hebrew speaker in the modern era. And they, of course, also had a lot of grunting and gestures in the house to talk about all the things that were there that they didn't necessarily have words for. It is said that they got a male dog and a female cat so that they could make sure that they had plenty of things to use all the pronouns and get all the genders correct. But of course, when they wanted to treat their little Itamar and to give him ice cream, they needed a word for ice cream. And so another source of words or ways to coin words, if you ever went to Jewish summer camp or been in Israel, so glida, fairly well-known word. It is from an ancient Hebrew root that's connected to the idea of frost or coagulation, gimel lamed daled, but the form glida was chosen to imitate gelato. Okay, so there is even though they didn't want to have foreign language influences, sometimes words were chosen for that purpose. Another word that was coined then was magevet, from the root the infinitive to linagev, which is to wipe or to dry. And I just point that out just because there's some interesting connections between roots. The Negev, the desert area in southern Israel, which is dry, is from the same root as the modern term magevet. Okay, so again, a lot more to be said, but there was a lot of updating that had to take place. And so what happened is we have this historical, religious, traditional Hebrew language, and then we have these modern people trying to live regular lives in late 19th century Eretz Israel, land of Palestine, and trying to speak Hebrew. And we'll talk about this in a second, but also with a lot of languages in their heads, because of course they were coming from all kinds of different places. And so it raises the question about what is the relationship between these. I mean, there were several different stages of language, but let's talk about essentially the old and the new. And here I put it in table form just to kind of clarify what I'm trying to compare here. You have this historical religious Hebrew, the HRH or whatever, the historical Hebrew, and then you have this contemporary vernacular Israeli, which was developing from them, which is of course still developing now. So essentially all Hebrew before the 19th century is that historical religious Hebrew, but then from the revival on, what was spoken there and then later on in the diaspora through Hebrew schools and summer camps and everything else, that became the vernacular language based on what Israelis speak. Okay, and as I said, the official language, one of the official languages with Arabic and English in Palestine in the 20s. So of course, that historical religious Hebrew was used primarily in the diaspora after it wasn't spoken anymore after the destruction of the Second Temple, etc. But obviously replaced originally by Aramaic and Greek, and obviously then all the other languages of the diaspora, and used primarily in prayer and traditional text study. Whereas the CV, I won't read everything in the table. You can see it here. But of course, that's just that's the spoken language in Israel, and of course also in other Jewish educational settings around the world. Nowadays, this historical religious Hebrew is what's called a heritage language because it is indeed used not so much for speaking. We use that other form of Hebrew, the vernacular Israeli, for conversational language in social and cultural situations. And similarly, I raise this as a question because I think most, anybody working in a Jewish educational setting or dealing with Hebrew language instruction. So obviously, with enough time, you can certainly embrace many different forms of the language, etc. But if your resources are limited, you have to decide whether you're doing it to facility for reading the Siddur, or for chanting your parasha for the bar mitzvah, or for ordering a falafel or reading an Israeli newspaper. So those definitely pull in different directions. Okay, as I mentioned, we refer to them by different names. Historical religious Hebrew is more like Sanskrit or Latin, whereas contemporary Israeli, it's like any other spoken language, but in some ways similar to modern Arabic, which also has a classical reflex. And Greek also went through similar processes of ancient Greek to modern Greek. And one of the things that I want to point out is that Hebrew, the idea of Hebrew is an amazing connective, again, going back to the idea of connectivity, a connecting concept between all the things that are Jewish, because Hebrew is so connected, Lashon HaKodesh is so connected to classical texts and prayer and everything connected to study, etc. So it's very Jewish in that way. It's the core of all Jewish languages, right? And you're probably familiar with Yiddish and Ladino, but there are another 20 Jewish languages from around the world, which are all of them are essentially some kind of combination of Hebrew and Jewish terms with some version of the vernacular language from around there. So Yiddish, of course, with the Germanic languages, Germanic and Slavic, Ladino with Spanish, with some Turkish and other Balkan languages thrown in. But there are others, as I said. But Hebrew is also the term we use in Israel for relating to things when we don't want to emphasize their Jewishness. So we talk about Tarbut Ivrit, Hebrew culture, or Hazemer Ivri, Hebrew music, and Ha'ivri Hadash, the new Hebrew. So the whole idea of Hebrew was some aspect of this past, which we have taken from our heritage, but have really secularized and modernized it in a way that separates it from those diasporic Jewish connotations. Okay, so it's just a very interesting concept that it's both the most Jewish, but also in some ways the most non or even anti-Jewish part of this complex we call contemporary Judaism. And of course, there are exceptions. There are amazing non-religious compositions in pre-modern Hebrew, whether it be drinking songs from medieval Spain, even homosexual ones, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, in contemporary Israeli Hebrew, there are plenty of people who use traditional Hebrew, whether through prayer or study or in other ways. Okay. So just to point out, and I'll be moving a little faster to leave enough time for questions, just to point out the fact that there is a gap. What I have here is chapter 11 of the book of Genesis. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. So I used a language-related story, and it begins in a very biblical way. Vayehi chol haaretz safa achat udvarim achadim. And the entire country, the entire world, all the land was one speech, one language, and unified or singular thing, whatever. The translation isn't so important. What I want to point out here is that what you see here on the left is a reproduction from this book that is here on this slide. That's called the Tanakh Ram, which is the Bible translated into Hebrew, okay? In other words, the traditional biblical text, which is on the right, translated into contemporary Israeli literary Hebrew, okay? Not slang, not street Hebrew, not like some, entertaining kind of version. No, it's meant to be used in schools because the sense was that Israeli kids, and I can testify to my own children, it's really hard to read the Bible, right? Maybe 2 generations ago, for a young secular Israeli to read the Bible was like an American or a British person reading Shakespeare. In other words, it's pretty difficult, but with a glossary you can get by. But now I think it's more like what it's like to try to read Chaucer. In other words, the language is seems that much more archaic. There are that many things that are not transparent. So while they used to have a version of the Bible for schools that had a glossary, like difficult words translated at the bottom, Now there's this version, which actually isn't used in most schools because most teachers are opposed to it. They say, oh, it takes all the value out of studying the Bible in the original. But many Israeli Bible teachers won't admit to the fact, or won't agree to the fact, recognize this idea that biblical Hebrew should be taught to native-born secular Israelis as more as a foreign language, where they really need to unpack the syntax and all the words that aren't clear anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this. That's the historical religious Hebrew. That's the contemporary Israeli. And so the question is not whether this is a good idea and we should support this educational innovation, but the fact that it's necessary, right? And so this goes back to what it means to re-vernacularize a language, right? That when people, in general, the natural thing to do is to learn a language in the home from your parents, right? Your parents speak to you from, day one, from the cradle, or even before day one, right, in the womb. And languages are transmitted from parents to children. That's sort of an organic or a natural way that languages are developed, which of course doesn't mean they don't change. They change a lot. And that's even the example of Chaucer to Shakespeare to all the intermediate stages to modern English is essentially an organic development. Maybe there was a little Norman invasion going on there, et cetera. But certainly from Middle English until now, it was basically natural changes that happened when new generations speak a language. But that's not how modern Hebrew got its start, right? As I mentioned, it was re-vernacularized by people essentially with other mother tongues. I mean, a lot of Europeans, right, who came over speaking Yiddish and German and Russian and other things. But of course, there were Jews from Arab countries, and so they spoke Ladino and Turkish and Arabic and other things. And so just think about for a second what happens when you learn to speak a foreign language, right? If you learn now to speak Spanish or French or whatever, you often make many mistakes because you translate a lot from that language that's in your head, say English, and you need native speakers around you to correct you, to make sure you say it in the way that they say it. And so you don't end up speaking in translation, right? But what do you do when there are by definition, there are no native speakers? And so that's why when we look at modern Hebrew today and you sort of take it apart, and I won't go into the technical analysis of it, but it's the roots, actually. One of the reasons why I emphasize the roots is that's the main connectivity to the historical Hebrew, things from the past. Of course, we have the alphabet and we have the morphology, the shape of the words, but really the roots is the bridge from old to new, whereas the sound system, right? If Moses were alive today, or Isaiah, or even Rabbi Akiva or something, if they came if we heard them speak, we probably would not understand them, and they certainly wouldn't understand us. But even the syntax, one of the things that kids have the most hard time with in understanding the Bible is the fact that sentences are built very differently, okay? And so the question that is behind this is whether Hebrew is Mosaic, and here's a picture of Moses, of course. And just briefly, if you're wondering what he's holding there, he's of course holding the two tablets of the law, the Ten Commandments. But what's written on those, if you can read Hebrew, you probably can't read that, and that's because that was the original Hebrew alphabet. Actually, Cecil B. DeMille and his staff really did their research, because that is indeed how the Ten Commandments would have looked had they been written down in 2000 BCE. Or 1600, whenever it was meant to have happened. And so the first thing that tells us that is that Hebrew has already undergone transformations. The Hebrew alphabet that we use today, as well as the contemporary calendar that we use in the Jewish year, was brought back actually from Babylonia from the first exile, right after destruction of the first temple in 586, and then return about 70 years later. They brought back the writing system that was used in Babylonian Aramaic, actually, a very closely related Semitic language, and like I said, the calendar. And so that's when they started writing Hebrew in the way that we could read it today. So when you ask if whether Hebrew is Mosaic or a Mosaic, right, is it put together with a lot of these pieces from different places? That's a picture of Moses with the scroll of the Torah. And here's a picture from a more modern mosaic. This is actually workers from the Tel Aviv port in the beautiful mosaic documenting the history of Tel Aviv in the Shalom Meir Tower. Very recommended if you ever get to Tel Aviv. So that's to what extent are we in a direct line of continuity, and to what extent does that break really mean something else. And my conclusion is that it's really not a linguistic question. It's a socio-psychological and a political question almost, because it's really a question of how do we see our chain of continuity, and the fact that we do have a very strong psychological and political sense of continuity means that we see ourselves as the inheritors of this language and the ones who continue it. Okay, so here's another little quote. Despite its historical layers and the influences of surrounding cultures, Hebrew is recognizably one language, and that fact makes it possible for me to savor the thrilling ways in which Hebrew roots do cartwheels. Wait a minute, did you see the cartwheels there? Hebrew roots do cartwheels and transform themselves over the ages. The very simultaneity of ancient and modern meetings is a wonder. And that is indeed the spirit of my remarks tonight. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. So just to wrap this up and really start to open things up for questions and comments. So when I ask these questions of whether Hebrew is old and holy and tribal, or whether it's new and secular and global, or is it both, I'm asking really about us as Jews. Can we find the way to make these connections between the ancient and sanctified and in-group side of our identities together with things that are innovative and new and secular and daily and connected to global culture? And I like this sort of graphic comparison here, that on the upper right-hand side of the slide, you see essentially a text from the Torah, from Parashat Ha'azino, which is traditionally written in these two columns. So it looks almost like these buildings, as it were. And on the bottom left, you have the Azrieli Towers in Tel Aviv. And I love this particular picture because it was taken after the movie Wonder Woman came out. And what they have highlighted in lights here is our appreciation of Gal Gadot. It says, Ge'im bach Gal Gadot, we're proud of you, Gal Gadot, the actress. And on the left-hand side, it says, Wonder Woman Shelanu, okay? So as I said, you learn how to say Wikipedia, and now you can learn how to say Wonder Woman. But what's especially interesting is that before Wonder Woman was a movie, those of you who have little comic books in your background know that she was a comic book character with a very interesting history, which I won't go into. But when the comic book was translated into Hebrew in Israel, they were less apt to use these kind of these foreignisms like Wonder Woman, and they looked for a good Hebrew phrase to describe this female superhero. And so the original Wonder Woman comics, when they came out in Israel, were called Eshet Chayil, okay? Eshet Chayil, which literally is a woman of valor, right? From the book of Proverbs, the hymn that's sung on Friday nights, sometimes from a husband to a wife, or to both of them together. So Eshet Chayil, the Wonder Woman of yesteryear. So connecting to Hebrew is, I think, important and significant for us as Jews, because let's face it, it's the only language that belongs to all Jews. And while I've actually, through my studies of Hebrew, grown to love Yiddish and Ladino and all these other Jewish languages, those are in some ways only partial, right? This is something that is really common to all of us. As I've tried to show, it connects old and new, past, present, and future, and the holy and the daily, the tribal and the global. And in that respect, I think if we're looking for things to help promote both individual Jewish identity, but also collective Jewish peoplehood, Hebrew is one of the few things that really can serve all these purposes. This is a quote from Isaac Herzog, and I have a picture of him holding my book, so I thought I'd use it. He's a former member of Knesset, and he's the director of the Jewish Agency. He says, "We have a rare and sacred national treasure, the Hebrew language. We must return to our national treasure. Hebrew can be a common denominator of all Jews from all streams of Judaism and of affiliated or non-affiliated Jews. Our beautiful language can serve as a tool for unity." And simply also because it's amazing. Okay. So those are my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to hear what you guys are saying, or what you're asking, or what you'd like to talk about.
Jeremy, thanks so much. That was wonderful. I'm going to monitor the chat. There are a couple of people who asked for the Wendy Zierler quote, which Diane kindly put into the chat so that people could see that.
Great.
First question. comes from our wonderful alumni, Dr. Neil Rubin, and his question is, with Hebrew having been Lashon Kodesh for about 1800 years, did Ben Yehuda consciously seek to make modern Hebrew a secular language or purposely create new words with religious meaning in mind, with the thought in mind that you showed the depth of the roots of words such as Kadosh? This is also interesting as he came from a traditional background, as did so many early Zionist leaders.
Yeah, that's true. He came from a traditional background with an education. He was also reviled by the ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem at the time for two reasons. One, he lived a secular lifestyle, and many of them took great glee that when he finally died, he died with a pen in his hand on Shabbat, writing another entry in his dictionary. But also for this idea of making Hebrew a daily language. Still today, there are those who don't accept this. Less so, if you've ever watched Shtisel, for instance, you see that the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, also speak contemporary Hebrew, and that is true. There are only certain small rejectionist pockets still around. What his intent was, I can't say. My sense it would be more the latter. I think he really was seeing Hebrew as an outgrowth of historical traditional Jewish experience, and that we need to build another layer onto this and connect to those roots, as it were, and to repurpose them. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are some amazing coinages. For instance, the word chashmal. It's the contemporary word for electricity. And that goes back, it's a term that's used in the book of Ezekiel as part of his mystical vision. And nobody knows what that originally was. The reason why it was coined that way, because it was whatever, I won't go into the whole linguistic thing, but it goes back to translations from ancient time connecting to electrum, et cetera, et cetera. But if his intention was to try to use these biblical terms in order to retain the connection. So when you read Ezekiel today, and he says that he saw something ke'ein hachashmal, instead of having some kind of mystical connotation of some otherworldly experience, you say, oh, he saw sparks. That's what chashmal is, right? I mean, because that's the word we use. Whereas, so some of these terms that have some spiritual depth to them, on some level, whether it was intentional or not, have been almost emptied out into these more shallow secular terms. And Gershom Scholem has a very moving piece that I quote in the book about the problem of that, the challenge of that. But that's one of the interesting dynamics of speaking Hebrew or learning Hebrew on all its different registers.
Thank you. Okay, here's another one. Is it important that obscure languages survive, for example, Aboriginal, which you mentioned, especially if there's no culture or writing associated with it?
Okay, well, first of all, I just want to take issue a little bit with the term obscure. They might be obscure to us. They're not obscure to the Aborigines. I mean, it's their language, right? And as we know, how much we feel connected to our, well, even if you're not a native speaker of Hebrew, what I want to suggest is that we should have some special feeling or connection to Hebrew as a vessel of our identity and culture. And I'm sure you feel that way for your own native language, and especially if you don't speak a big imperialist language like English, right? I mean, there are plenty of languages that have small bodies of native speakers without many people elsewhere speak, like, I don't know, Finnish, right? There aren't too many people who speak Finnish around the world, but Finnish is the national language of the Finns, and there are national sagas in Finnish, and I'm sure they put up a lot of fights when there's too much invasion of English because of all kinds of, called coco-colonialism. But it's important for those languages to be well. Yes, I mean, I think that it's important to preserve cultures around the world. I think a world with fewer cultures is a greatly impoverished world, and cultures are communicated through language. And it is true that languages that don't have a written dimension to them, that aren't, that are just spoken languages, have a much harder time in doing this. And in fact, one of the keys to the revival of Hebrew was the fact that we have such a rich literary tradition, of course, for all kinds of reasons. And so, in fact, one of the things that's done is, the first thing that's done is to transcribe spoken languages and make sure that there's a written base so that that can be communicated and built upon, et cetera, et cetera. So, so my answer would be enthusiastically yes, that it's very important to preserve these things.
Thank you. This is a question from one of our graduate students, Daphna Oren. Can you comment on the recent scholarship by an Israeli to rewrite the Torah with gender neutrality? Is it something Israeli/scholars would really take up?
Well, I hadn't heard about the idea of rewriting the entire Torah with gender neutrality. It's a big enough ask just to get sort of contemporary Israeli text to be gender neutral, and it is definitely a challenge. And there are definitely great, people and minds working on it. There are also, in terms of the writing, I'll relate to the Torah in a second, but in terms of writing, it's actually not as hard as speaking. And if you know Hebrew, then you know why, because you can write without vowels, which means that there are many forms that when you actually have to read them aloud, you have to decide whether it's referring to masculine or feminine. But if it's just in the written form, it's ambiguous in that way. So that's good. And in fact, there was just, I teach a course not about Hebrew, but it's something else at Tel Aviv University, and there was just a memo or a directive out that all exams need to be written in the instructions need to be written in the plural. That there have been these sociolinguistic studies showing that female students do worse on exams when the instructions are written in the standard way, which is second person singular masculine as the default thing, that for various psychological reasons of it feeling like this whole test is addressed to males, etc. But that was easily solved. Instead of saying tichtov, second person singular masculine, right? So kitvu, right, plural, so it doesn't, so it's gender neutral. And again, the spoken language is harder. If you've been following Israeli politics, the new head of the Labor Party, Merav Michaeli, a very prominent feminist activist, this is one of her big crusades, is to get people to speak in a more egalitarian way. And sometimes that just means addressing crowds as feminine instead of masculine, because why just masculine? If it's going to be something and it has to be one thing, well, let's alternate, or let's raise people's awareness to the fact that when you say masculine, it's not gender neutral. And so saying feminine. So about the idea of rewriting the Torah, I'd be very curious to see that. Of course, you would have to make make divinity gender neutral as well. Again, I mean, it's nothing like that. Just like the Tanakh Aram doesn't replace the Torah, it sets another column alongside. So we still have that original along with the more recent versions. Throughout Jewish history, there have been Targumim. There have been all kinds of translations and commentaries, etc. So if we had one to try to take the text and put it in, I would think that would be a great addition to the sacred literature.
Thank you. This one comes from Nancy Schweiss. She says, what happened to Russian Jews who made Aliyah in the 19th century? What language or languages did they speak?
Well, again, like Ben Yehuda, most of the Jews who made Aliyah, in other words, for Zionist reasons, coming to work the land or whatever, which is part of the first Aliyah in the 1880s, 1890s, and then the second Aliyah in the early 1900s. Second Aliyah was a little bit more radical politically, and they were the ones who founded the initial Klutzot and Kibbutzim. Obviously, many of them came with their, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but for many of them, their whole goal in coming to Israel was to transform their lives. And if they were going to move halfway around the world, and of course, remember, this is before emails, etc., like you were really making a massive transition, it would take, a month or more to come from Russia to Palestine in half a dozen forms of transport. It's a very big deal. So if you're making that transformation, then and you might have been going from a shopkeeper or a student or something to some kind of proletarian, or the farmer or other kind of worker, and you're transforming yourself in that way. So it wasn't so unexpected, or wasn't so such a crazy thing to also change your language. And when people look at the reasons why the revernacularization of Hebrew succeeded, that's in fact one of them. That it wasn't, and this is one of the differences between those other languages, right, to Aboriginal, etc. It wasn't an old guard, right, an aging population, some of whom still spoke this traditional language. We're trying to teach it to the young. The forces for renewal, for speaking the language, came from the younger generation, from those young Eastern Europeans, etc., who moved to the land of Israel and took up a new life. And it just made sense for them that they're living in the age-old country, trying to rejuvenate an age-old society. So let's rejuvenate the language as well. So many of them, of course, broke their teeth. I mean, in the metaphorical sense, that's what we say in Hebrew. Do you say that in English? I don't remember. In other words, in the difficulty of learning the new language, et cetera, spoke haltingly. But some became Israel's greatest, poets and literary talents in this second or third or fourth language of theirs, which was Hebrew.
Okay, I'm going to thank you so much. This is so interesting, and I'm sure we could keep going on and on. I'm going to end with this last question from Sandy Winters, who many of us know. How do you account for some of the invented words in Hebrew, like machshev and matzlema, stuck and televisia and garage and cognates, that are widely accepted?
Wait, I'm sorry. Could you ask that again? So they're the invented words, the coined
Invented
words.
I guess is the question. How did those become widely accepted?
Okay, yeah. No, that's a great question, and it's something the academia, the Hebrew Language Academy, is it's their job. First of all, I mean, one of the things that they're in charge of is trying to ride this bucking bronco of a language and direct it in some way, trying to help get new coinages accepted. And they've actually gotten with it a little bit, both in the sense that they realize that they can't impose their very academic ivory tower will on the people and the language as she is spoke in the street. But also they can take advantage of things like that. They now, instead of just scholars creating learned new neologisms, sometimes they say, well, we need a word for selfie, for instance, and they crowdsource it. Like, they put it out to the public in a more gamified way through social media and stuff. Like, how would you say selfie? And so, yeah, so some words, like no Israeli native Hebrew speaker in Israel says computer or something. We use the word machshev, which is from the root, which means to think and also to calculate. So that's good. And as was said, matzlema, from this great biblical root, selem, meaning image. And so the thing that takes images, a camera. But as the examples were good ones, like television and telephone, there are pure Hebrew versions of that just never stuck. And I don't know if one can give sort of general reasons why some things work and some things don't. Sometimes the more technical they are, then you might have a more closed group of professionals using it, and it would spread out from there. Whereas things that are really popular, especially if they're technologies that exist somewhere else, like this, I guess computer would be the exception for this, but like television, telephone, it just sort of seeped in before they could make try to direct or control the acceptance of the words that were being used. On the other hand, now sometimes it's even harder to get new words for new things, just because of exposure through social media, telecommunications, et cetera, and the very global class. I mean, we are the startup nation after all, but the whole high-tech industry, there's so many Israelis who spend time in some other locale, whether it's Silicon Valley or Route 90 or wherever. And so they come back with all kinds of Anglicisms or internationalisms, whatever, how the global high-tech industry works. And so some of those are seeping into the language as well. So it's a continual struggle.
Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Benstein. That was really a wonderful presentation. On behalf of the Baltimore Hebrew Institute, I'd like to again express my deep gratitude and appreciation to the family of Shoshana Cardin, blessed memory, for their continued support of this biennial lecture. Thank you all for attending today. And if you've not yet registered for our final lecture of this academic year, Amsterdam's People of the Book, The Untold Story of the Jews, the Reformation, and the Bible, which is scheduled for 5:30 p.m. on April 28th, please see the link that Diane has just put in the chat and register now. Enjoy the rest of your day. It was wonderful to have you all with us, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benstein. Take care.